Good morning and good evening. It's a pleasure and delight to welcome to this conversation Professor Sherry Turkle, who's the Abbey Rockefeller Professor of Social Science and Technology at MIT. And she has a very, very impressive bio sketch, which I would if you haven't looked at it, look at it online. And she's a prolific author and a writer, and recently came out with her latest book on empathy, a very personal book, Empathy Diaries. And if you haven't read it already, I highly encourage you all. But Sherry, it's such a delight to have you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Maybe I'll just start with a rather simple question. What motivated you to write this book?
It was a book that I had always wanted to read. My work is a passion. My work about the ethics of artificial intelligence, about how technology, I believe, can undermine conversation, can undermine, without meaning to, it doesn't have a will to do this, but it can undermine, I believe, a kind of empathic encounter. This is I'm compelled to do this. I'm in it deeply. And I've always wanted to read the backstory of how people who are deeply engaged with their work, who are these people? How does their work intersect with their life? And I knew that that was my case. I mean, I knew that I had a life in which empathy as the through line was a crucial leitmotif, was the crucial through line. And I felt I want to read that book. I want to read the book that tells the backstory of why my work is lit, and I felt that I would not be harming anyone. I'm respectful to, it's not a, I've reached a point in my life and in my own introspection where I'm not out to get anybody. It's not an expose. It's not, I've made my peace, with people. And I felt that I could tell that story and make fun of myself and, when I had to. And I just tell that story. And I learned a lot about myself along the way. And I think I learned a lot about technology and its vulnerabilities too. So it just was time for me to do that. It was just time for me to do that.
That's wonderful, and I think we'll touch more on the subject of technology and its vulnerabilities, given that we are both sort of parked at one of the bastions of a place that gives us the signal of techno-optimism. Going back to the book, one of the place that you begin this journey is with your father and sort of his challenge in understanding what empathetic relationships might look like. How did that prompt you in your own sort of personal and professional journey of exploring this sort of fundamental human nature?
Well, the book is a kind of mystery story because my mother left my biological father when I was very young, but didn't want anyone to know that she had been married. So I was left as the kind of holder of this family secret. I wasn't supposed to use his name. When my mother remarried, she had me using my Turkle, which was my stepfather's name, even though my name was Sherry Zimmerman. I wasn't allowed to use the Zimmerman name. So At school, my name was Sherry Zimmerman. But then when I came home, I had to hide the papers from school and pretend my name was Sherry Turkle until much later I was adopted. So now my name is Sherry Turkle legally, but for years and years, not till I was really a late adolescent, I had to hide my papers. Nobody could find out. I lived a kind of life as a double agent. And the mystery to me was why this secrecy? Why? So his first role in my story was that I couldn't see him, I didn't know who he was, and I had to lie about him. And I had to figure out through, nobody was being empathic with me, like what that was doing to me, but I had to figure out what was going on in the heads of all the adults in my life that would make them want me to tell this fake story. And that did a couple of things. I mean, to get back to your question of how it informed my work. First of all, it taught me that in families, there's often a story next to the official story. So it got me ready to be a psychologist and a sociologist and a psychoanalyst, because it got me ready to look for the story adjacent to the story. There's a tradition in French social theory that says when you look at the normal, you study it by looking at what's being repressed. And that was certainly the case in my life, that the Brooklyn normal in my family repressed everything that was true about my life. And then it set me on a life, it made me marginal. I always felt like an outsider. And there's a lot in my book about the role of an outsider and what that special role of an outsider is in being able to see the truth of things. And I think that very much coming to MIT, even choosing that as a place to work, has sort of set me up as a lifetime outsider in my place of business, where I felt kind of comfortable in a role. It reminded me of the things you can see or the things you set yourself up to see if you are an outsider. And then finally, I think that I set myself up for a lifetime of seeking him out. I finally found him with detectives and, and really, I was a Nancy Drew of my own life to find this father who'd been hidden from me. And sure enough, he was somebody who my mother was afraid of and wanted to keep from me. He was a mad scientist who had done experiments on me when I was a child. She had reason to be afraid of him. And he was somebody who was the opposite of empathic. And that gave me a lot of food for thought about how important the role of empathy is, obviously, in life. And although I didn't know this at the time, I've certainly done a lot of work in thinking about how that made empathy the centerpiece of my story in my own life.
Great, and then
That's a lot for your answer.
no, it's perfect. It's perfect, and I recall that when you in the book you mentioned that when your father actually opened the door, he thought that you had found him because of this ad about disproving Einstein that he had given out.
I have to set the scene. So I hired a detective to find him, and I found him. And he when I just started working at MIT, so I'm like 20, maybe I'm 29 by the time I find him. And he lives in a little apartment in Queens, and he opens the door, and of course the shock, because he looks like me. I don't know if any of you listening have ever for the first time met a biological parent as an adult, but it's shocking. I mean, you see for the first time the face that is your face, and it was very emotional. It was just absolutely very emotional. I remember having very similar feeling when I went back to the town in in what's now Poland. It used to be part of Russia, where my family is from, Volozhin. And the people of Volozhin, many of them look like me. And it was kind of like, but there's my father, and he looks like me. And and he says to me, "Did you find me through the New York Times?" And of course, I've been like, had spent all of my MIT salary for 2 years, which wasn't very much, but was all I had, finding him with detectives. And there used to be an ad that the New York Times Classified used, which was, you can find your job through the New York Times. And I kept thinking, he must have taken an ad for me. He must have been looking for me. And what he meant was that he had taken an ad out because he'd written a book which said disproving Einstein. He thought he had disproved Einstein, and the ad said E equals MC squared is not correct. Queens high school teacher disproves Einstein. For more information, write. And that was Dad. And so he was kind of a crank scientist, and that was my father. And he was doing experiments on me. He thought he was kind of like a baby Skinner. And when my mother discovered him doing these psychological experiments on me, she left him. She packed up some bags with some diapers and some few pieces of clothing for her, and she left. And she never wanted it to be known what his story was or who he was. She thought it would taint me. She thought he would follow up. I mean, she just thought it was shameful who he was and what he was, and she didn't want anyone to know. And she didn't want me to know who my father was.
It's very surreal. It almost, at least the beginning of it, almost reads like a thriller. It's remarkable that you spent 2 years of MIT salary on detectives.
Yes, it was hard to find him. There was no
right.
Google. There was no Ancestry.com. There was,
right.
I knew nothing about him. It was very hard. It was very hard.
Coming to this sort of framing on understanding empathy, which is sort of the common thread in all of your work and your writing. One of the things that was intriguing is sort of a different take on the presumptions around how people can be empathetic. That oftentimes we use sort of this almost colloquial expression that I know how you feel, which personally shocked me. It was one of my first cultural shock experiences coming from India to the US, when people would say something like, I know how you feel. And you suggest that perhaps that's not the best point to begin an empathetic conversation. Perhaps the best point is to admit that I actually do not know how you feel. Could you elaborate more on the assumptions that are set by I know how you feel versus sort of entering a conversation with this blank slate of I actually do not know how you feel?
Yeah, well, to me, that's crucial. That the empathic conversation begins with I don't know how you feel. I don't know how you feel, but I am here to listen. And I'm here not just to listen to put myself in your place, but to really put myself in your problem, in the sense that I'm making a commitment to you. It's not a sort of feel good kumbaya moment, peace, love. It's really it's a commitment to you to see it through with you, and to be vulnerable to you, because you are going to make yourself vulnerable to me. And so it's a kind of mutual journey, because people don't make themselves vulnerable to people who are sitting there and saying, well, look, I know how you feel. You've been divorced. I've been divorced. I know, people make themselves vulnerable to people who who are vulnerable as well, and who say, I'm going to make a commitment to you and I'm going to see the store with you. So I have a little bit of a higher standard for what it means to really engage in an empathic being there. And more than that, you have to come to it. And I don't want to make this sound so hard, because most people are capable of it and do this every day. So I don't want to make this sound like that, this is like the impossible dream. But you have to come to it with a certain kind of emotional preparation, which is to say that you have to come to it not looking for the other person to tell you who you are. You have to come to it with some sense of who you are, so that you can really listen to somebody else and hear them as a different person from you. And I'm dwelling on this, and I hope we talk about this a little bit more, because this is actually a sticking point in our current life on screens. Because if you grow up looking to your screens and looking to distraction for your sense of self, you never really learn kind of who you are, you alone. And you do get this sense of, I am what I share. Mm-hmm. I am what my screen reflects back to me. And in order to be empathic, in order to form a relationship of mutuality, you have to come to it knowing who you are, so I can hear you for who you are. And that, to this day and age, with every screen open, 4 screens open, the Instagram's open, the Facebook profiles there, that can be hard to do, particularly for young people. So that's something I'm very interested in. Developing a self that's ready to be empathic. And I sometimes say empathy begins in solitude. It's in solitude that empathy is born, because it's in solitude that we develop that capacity to be a self, to know who we are by ourselves.
That's beautiful. It's I mean, this pandemic, has forced us perhaps to distinguish between experiences of loneliness versus solitude. And qualitatively, these are two different experiences. In solitude, oftentimes people thrive, they're creative, they flourish. And as you said, they perhaps become more self-aware. Whereas in experiences of loneliness, it's an experience of almost torturing oneself and looking for distractions and so on. And what would you suggest to individuals in terms of this continued value of seeking solitude? Meaning that humans have a long history of being contemplatives, where they actually seek out this experience of solitude. Whereas today we are in a society where we are grappling with loneliness almost as an epidemic. How do you suggest that individuals navigate between these two worlds?
Well, this is such a good question, because I'm asked so much. Well, was this pandemic what you had in mind? Was this enough solitude for you? And I say, I like talking about solitude. I didn't mean solitary confinement. Right. So I think, first of all, some definitions are in order. Masochism was not, on the menu for me. That you teach. There's a wonderful expression literature, which is that if you don't teach your children to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of captures the thought that you're raising. It is that you teach children how to find a center within themselves, not so they can be in solitude, lonely, but so that they won't be lonely. And they won't be lonely for two reasons. They won't be lonely because when people feel a sense of, I know who I am, I know who I am, those are the people who people want to be with. Because those are the people who, when they meet another person, they bring a whole person to the conversation. And we love being with those people because they're not looking to an interaction to, kind of be a person by kind of, being like Invasion of the Body Snatchers with another person. They say, well, here's who I am. And who are you? I'm asking because I know who I am and I'd love to hear your story. So that's one reason why people who can be alone with themselves are not lonely, is because other people are drawn to them. And the second way that people who can cultivate solitude are not lonely is that they have the inner space for creativity. They can look at a screen and say, I wonder what I think. I wonder what my thoughts are. I don't have to be all over the web. I don't have to be running around. I don't have to be looking at this and that. I can compose a thought. I can compose a poem. I can stare out at the water. Do I have something new to say? So they have a capacity for creativity and coming up with new materials and for art and for thought, because they can tolerate silence and they can tolerate the pauses of letting their mind go blank and seeing what comes to them. They can tolerate just letting ideas pass through and saying, good idea, bad idea, mediocre idea, heard that idea before, new idea. This takes a capacity for solitude. It's not a lonely feeling. It's a feeling of observing your thoughts and judging them, but not being anxious that there's not 50 other people who are, upvoting and downvoting them.
Right.
So the capacity for solitude is very precious for creativity and it's very precious for sociability. The question is how to get there. How to get there if you haven't cultivated it yet. I think that's sort of what people, and how to see the difference. If you're saying, oh my God, I'm lonely, the last thing I feel I'm lonely in this pandemic, the last thing I'm able to do now is cultivate a little solitude. It's really not necessarily true, because the way children cultivate the way you cultivate solitude in children is that as an adult, you take a walk with them, and together, child and adult, you are quiet together. So to cultivate solitude, you don't have to cultivate it alone. You can be alone with someone else and develop a capacity for solitude. And I really stress this because for parents who would like their children to develop this quality and who see how important it is and understand how important it is for the lifetime of your child, for the creativity, for the sociability, you sit with your child, and together you read a book, each of you alone. Together you sit by the water's edge and just hold the child's hand and look at the water. Together you take a walk by the water's edge, not saying much, just staring at the water or in the forest or something that brings you into nature, so that the child appreciates that you can go within and have the child as company while you go within. So learning to take a walk, if you don't have a friend handy to do this, learning to do this with earbuds and music, if you want that as your company, that begins to get you into the feeling of being with yourself, that's a kind of training. Taking short walks in beautiful places, taking a walk with a friend is a start. I mean, anything that gets you into a habit of a kind of quiet, reflective habit where you're not reaching, reaching for outside stimulation. And it can be with another person, it can be with music, it can be with poem. It's to get you back to yourself.
Great, great. So the idea that the experience of quietude and stillness need not be a solo activity, that it can actually be done with another. It can actually be even done in a group of individuals, in nature, elsewhere, and so on. Sherry, one of the challenges that we are experiencing today in civic society is.
I just want to add, I learned to be alone, sitting next to my grandmother on a bench in Prospect Park. She was a woman who loved her inner life. She loved her, and she loved me. And she would say, I'm thinking of my inventions, Sherry. She loved inventing things. She made many. She'd say, I'm thinking of my inventions, Sherry. And she would hold my hand and she would think of her inventions. And she said, you should think of your inventions. And
Beautiful.
She thought of her inventions in Prospect Park in Brooklyn. I thought of my inventions, and here we are today. So
beautiful.
I just wanted to add that to your, lest you think that I took off time to go to a monastery or something. No, I just wanted to make sure I situated my capacity for solitude in the right socioeconomic. She thought of her inventions, and I thought of my invention. I'm sorry.
Beautiful.
Next question.
No, in fact, one of my earliest experiences of being in solitude was actually also with my grandmother, where the morning ritual was pretty much sitting quietly while she fed the birds, and we did that for like an hour every morning.
Okay.
And we didn't feel the obligation to entertain one another. It was just the sheer sort of power of observation, of seeing things around you, of just absorbing you, and so on. And it's beautiful, and I do hope that many who are listening and many who will listen to this later actually experiment with such things of solitude. I think people have this misguided notion that monasteries are places of solitude. It's hard to be in solitude with 3,000 monks, living in the same complex. So a bench in a park sounds like a wonderful idea. I wanted to shift the conversation a bit to this to the current state of society, where we are experiencing tremendous sense of polarization and tribalism, to the point where a lot of people are talking. There's a lot of noise, but there isn't enough quality conversation, and it is being reflected in how people make political decisions, how people make social choices, and so on. And in fact, there have been many initiatives in recent months, in recent year, to try to sort of bridge this divide in certain ways. But moving from the individual to organizational scenarios, to research centers who are trying to sort of promote empathetic conversations and so on, what would you tell them? What sort of advice would you give them, rather than them just venturing into this idea that we are going to bring people together?
Well, one thing that I feel very strongly about I'm in many conversations about this. And one thing, when people read the empathy diaries, I really stress is that empathy is not the same as agreement. in our culture, empathy has come to mean, on the one hand, I get you. And on the other hand, it's come to mean I'm with you, like I agree with you, I'm on your side. That's not empathy. Empathy is I hear you. I'm putting myself in your place. I'm seeing the world from your perspective. I'm doing the hard work, the incredibly hard work of seeing the world from your history, your socioeconomic background, your growing up, your racial, cultural, ethnic. I mean, your um, and religious and historical. I'm working. I'm learning. Um, it's not, oh, got it. It's hard. It takes a long time. It involves talking. It doesn't involve putting on a set of, I often have this conversation with people who said, put on Oculus glasses and be there. The kind of empathy I'm talking about does not involve, feeling that you're in a room. It involves like really understanding someone's, I'm not saying don't put on glasses if it helps, but you need to really understand where somebody, got their ideas and who gave them those ideas, and but it's not acceptance. And so I think that the first part of this conversation that needs to happen needs to begin with the ground rules that we're going to be having a lot of talking, and it doesn't mean at the end that I'm going to like you or agree with you, or somehow going out for beer at the end is going to be what we're going to want to do with each other, but we're going to figure out if we can run a country together, for example, if we can participate in some kind of political process together, for example, in some kind of negotiation together, for example, if we can be in a university together, for example. Or we have to kill each other? That's off the table. So, so there has to be, I think, a different kind of set of what the ground rules for empathy are, that takes judgment and agreement out of this equation and puts a lot more hard work and intellectual content into it. I'll give you a good example. I mean, from my book. I describe a scene in my book when I'm a little girl, and I was I talk about myself as the designated adult in my family. And that means that whenever somebody would come to the house to fix the plumbing, or the toilet would be clogged, or a light would be too high and we didn't have a step ladder, it needed to be changed, the superintendent would need to become in our apartment building, I would be the one from 3 years old on who would go to the door, let them in, tell them the job, pay them, tip them, get a receipt, make sure it was done, and let them out. And my grandparents would get dressed up and sit on the couch, all dressed up. My grandmother would have her pocketbook with her, and my grandfather would be in a suit. Sometimes he would have the suit jacket on the chair next to him. He would be in a suit, a white shirt. And as I did this, it took years for me to understand what was going on in those exchanges. The shadow of the Holocaust was sitting on top of every time we had a light bulb changed. And for me to understand my grandparents took me, and it was like so improbable. I mean, even telling the story, I mean, I'm tearing up, but I mean, we were in Brooklyn, New York, but that was why they were dressed up. They were experiencing something about needing to be ready when a stranger came into the house. Nobody came into our house. It was a fortress. Now, to be empathic with my grandparents, what would it mean to be empathic with my grandparents? That's not a matter of coming in, chatting with them. I get you. That's work. Because you could look at them and say, scared, frightened people, these are not pleasant people. You know what I mean?
Yes, that's remarkable. That's remarkable.
So empathy is a hard one. That's why it took me so long to write this. I mean, it took me a lifetime really to be ready to write about all of this, because I needed to be ready to just see it for what it was. It wasn't, it was really the legacy in 1950s Brooklyn of what the Holocaust meant for American Jews, who pretty much most of the time passed as normal, but there were certain triggering things, strangers in a house, that brought them back to something so primitive. And empathy with them, non-judgmental empathy, took a lot of work.
That's remarkable. I think it's a very powerful reminder that that empathy perhaps does not imply trying to understand somebody else on our terms, but
Right.
understanding the other on their terms. And
exactly. And it's
takes,
and I think in our country now, as we try to understand people who are, you know, from let's say from the point of view of somebody like me, behaving like they're from another planet, I need to do some work. I'm reminded every day that I need to do hard work, because I think a lot of my friends would come in and see my grandparents and say, frightened people, are they immigrants? You know, and not do the work.
I think thank you for sharing that, Sherry. One of the challenges that I think we're also sort of facing a fair amount is where do we look for capacity building and empathy? You know, you had such a rich life, certain experiences that drove you to explore this particular quality, this particular trait that is very valuable for sort of this human dimensions of all kinds of experiences. But one of the challenges that we oftentimes find is that and here I'm trying to make a distinction between biased versus unbiased empathy. That we oftentimes find that people are kind or nice or understanding or even listening to individuals who look like them, speak the same language, believe in similar things, and so on. Do humans actually have the aptitude to move beyond a tribal sense of empathy, the empathy that is dictated by this sense of likeness, to be able to truly experience other in a manner that is not tethered by this tribal sense?
Well, you know, this is what has given empathy a bad name. I mean, empathy has gotten, you know, the worst rep in recent years. I mean, I'm forgetting the names of the book. I mean, this book's called Empathy Not Against Empathy. Please take empathy off my plate. Anything but empathy. You know,
Yep.
and so it's for two reasons. One has to do with the general cognitivist, you know, movement. A second, I think, is a kind of technological desire for technological fix, conscious or unconscious, where like, okay, well, look, instead of having empathy, Could I just have the experience? You know, what about this? I remember doing a study of Google Glass and having not many years ago, but um, when it first came out, and the study lasted about 3 years, and you know, where people were talking about Google Glass as a kind of empathy app, because people felt like, okay, hold on, I'm going to let a Black person wear Google Glass, record their experience, and I'm going to watch and have the experience of seeing what it's like to be walking along a street and have people crossing to the other side of the street. And I'm going to have a kind of firsthand experience of what it's like to, you know, walk while being Black, drive while being Black, you know, and that will make Google Glass an empathy app for me. So there's been a kind of desire to, now it's enhanced reality or artificial reality. I mean, different ways of thinking that you could make your way around empathy by having these empathy apps. But then the third thing that you raise is we are a tribal, you know, everything about us is designed, maybe neurologically, maybe biologically, to want to bond with our own kind. And that empathy is fighting against really the nature of, you know, that the Enlightenment story was just that. It was a story, but it's a story, and that it doesn't take into account the reality of kind of the human animal and the human animal's predilections. And I personally think that's a kind of cop out, you know, by people who, again, you know, for their own, I was going to use the word racist.
Well, you can, because it is, yes.
For their own reasons, whatever their reasons are, don't want to be in communities that are more complicated than the communities they grew up in.
Right.
And I don't think that I'm in a community that's more complicated than the community I grew up in, and I like it a lot better. And I've had, you know, I mean, I think that really the empathy diary is an immigrant story. I grew up in a community much simpler than the community I live in now. And I find the community, in terms of its racial mix, in terms of its ethnic, and in terms of its cultural and religious and every kind of mix, in terms of who could be, you know, what religion you could be, if you could be, what color you could be, what country you could be from, everything about everything. And my life is so enhanced. And I just think it's the idea that people want to, you know, kind of put down empathy and glorify this tribal, this simpler tribal impulse, and say, oh, the empathy story is too complicated. No, I just really disagree.
Right.
And again, empathy for me is not acceptance. It's not agreeing. It's a human capacity that enlarges us. And it is a distinctly human capacity. I also don't think machines can do it. This is where I get into, it's kind of like the fight I love to, it's like the fight I love to hate. I mean, you know, I've had this quarrel with generations of students at MIT, with generations actually of faculty at MIT. I tell a story in the book, but fighting with Marvin Minsky, about whether children should watch Bambi because it gets them into the bad habit of thinking that machines won't be our best companions. So I'm, you know, after having that fight with Marvin Minsky, like, bring it on. You know, I mean, I think this is a human capacity because humans know about death, humans know about fear and anxiety, and so I'm for people having this human capacity. It's a long answer to a short question.
No, I think that's you know, again, to
A comprehensive answer.
again, to reiterate that empathy is hard work, and there is you know, capacity building there as well, that people should not just be content with the idea that I have neurological limitations of how empathetic I can be. And it shows on, it goes on to show in terms of, you know, its other sort of manifestations emerging from empathy, going into a sense of care and compassion and all those sort of attributes. And one of the things that I have found where individuals who are trying to suggest that robots will look more like humans are actually very sort of robotic versions of humans themselves, and that is what they wish to sort of replicate in certain ways. One question I did have in terms of your own experience as you're over the years, as you have met with technologists, individuals in the field of sciences who are working on AI and robotics and so on. Do you think that there is actually a pathological limitation for certain individuals to fully appreciate what empathy is?
I think there are some individuals, maybe some people on the spectrum, mm-hmm. where that might be the case. Mm-hmm. But most of the people with whom I've gotten into the make me a robot is my make me a robot psychotherapist, that would be so cool. Mm-hmm. Do not have this limitation. They are loving fathers, loving wives, loving mothers, loving, I mean, they've empathized with me when I've had troubles, illness. I mean, so no. In other words, I think that I don't take someone who, I don't pathologize the field of inquiry. I'm not saying that you can't, you know, you can't bring me an example of somebody where I say, well, you know, that person, you know, maybe. But I've never been tempted to pathologize this field of inquiry because I know these people. That's one of the advantages, I think. You know, we're joking around about why being at MIT is an outsider. But one of the advantages, you know, of being at MIT as an insider in terms of having friends and colleagues here who I, you know intimately, is that I know them as full people who are capable of great love and caring. So I'm not, no, I don't, I'm never tempted to pathologize a field of inquiry. But I do, the individuals in a field of inquiry, mm-hmm. I do pathologize where a field of inquiry leads you to make statements about what would be good for people. And let me give a good example. The notion that life should be friction-free fascinates me. The value of friction-free life. Now it's good when machines are friction-free. This is excellent. But the number of times that I've seen engineers try to create apps for people that will make their lives more friction-free. In the Empathy Diaries, I joke about one. It's an app where you put it in and it gets you to your Starbucks, where you have your mochaccino frappe or whatever, by never crossing your ex-girlfriend or your ex-wife or your department head or anybody you've ever had a fight with. So it's like I ask, who wants life to be friction free? Well, apparently technology does.
Right,
But
right.
but the idea that, in fact, human beings, our lives are filled with passion and fights and disagreements and no, you this and I that, and I really disagree with you there. And if this conversation, we have a short amount of time and it's kind of about my book, but if we really got into it, I mean, I have so many questions for you and we disagree and it would be interesting, within 15 minutes, it would be all frictiony and it'd be great. And we want to keep that.
Yep,
we want to keep that.
Yeah. I think friction is where we learn the most.
Absolutely.
About ourselves and about the world.
Where we fall in love, and it's where we raise our children, and it's where we make art, and it's where we fall out of love, and it's where we fall back in love. And it reminds me of a book review by Christopher Geertz about a book about sociobiology. It was one of the first books on sociobiology. It was many years ago. It was in the early 80s. And he wrote, it was in the New York Review of Books, and it began, "This is a book about human behavior, and it says nothing about the following things: passion, lust, sex, abandonment, attachment," and it goes on to craving, desire, and then he says it could be one. It could only be one thing, and it is a book about sociobiology. And I feel it's a little bit like that. Engineers have to back off, certain areas, I think, of human attachment and connection.
Yeah. But I also think that it is this classic example oftentimes that we see in tech sectors of virtue signaling or mislabeling something. So rather than calling it an app for a friction-free life, it's actually an app for avoidance, and
Yes.
and that's what it should be. But all the attributes of how we learn, how we flourish in complexity, that it is overlooked in many ways. I would urge the audience, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the text, and we'll be getting to it. Sherry, one of the things that we're also witnessing is ever more deterioration in civic trust. Social media platforms are contributing to that. Again, the sense of tribal nature, false sense of security, everything is contributing to that. What would you suggest that we, either as an educational enterprise or even as a civic society, can look into in order to promote, build, repair trust in civic society?
Well, I really do think that social media needs to be taken for what it is, which is our current source of information, our current newspapers, our current ways of getting civic information. During the campaign, I carefully studied disinformation about COVID on Facebook. Civic trust. I mean, here was people treated for good or for bad. There was a code about health information on Facebook, and that code was not followed. Mm-hmm. So we need to, we need to treat. We need to in democracies, we need to treat social media, bring them within the kinds of norms that we need. We that we treated our media system and the accountability of our media system in the democratic process. The free speech is one thing, but lying with lying with dangerous health consequences or political consequences is not okay. So you can't sort of talk abstractly about no civic trust and have large groups of people getting information that's dangerous, not true, and actionable from a group of people who are making the most money and who are sort of the senior kind of pillars of the community from the point of view, and scraping your data and using your data to sell you things and kind of profiting off your disinformation. So, I mean, I think that what I believe and what I try to argue in the Empathy Diaries is that there's a kind of golden triangle, not just in this book, but in all my recent work, is that there's a kind of golden triangle of democracy, intimacy, and privacy. And until we get that right, until we see the relationship between democracy, intimacy, and privacy, we are going to have a very hard time. And trust is maybe a phrase that brings them together, but trust, you don't begin by unraveling the thread by saying, well, we got to trust. I wouldn't. Right. I wouldn't trust.
You cannot demand that of
have
people.
People understand that you can't have democracy without privacy. You can't have, you can't have intimacy without privacy. You can't have. Actually, I talk about, there's a moment in the Empathy Diaries where I talk about my grandmother, who I love so much, taking me to the mailboxes in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And she says to me, of course, she was wrong because there was J. Edgar Hoover and, she was not fully aware, but she says, in this country, the mail is private. It's a federal offense to interfere with the mail. That's why we're here. And what she meant was that the Jews were spied upon in Europe. Right. So she had a limited view, but she said, that's why we're in this country. It's a federal offense. It's private. You need privacy for democracy. You need privacy for democracy. So she had this kind of view about privacy and democracy that was ingrained in me. And now, it's like we've forgotten that. And people, I mean, the one thing about the pandemic, and I'm certainly not a Pollyanna, I don't have a Pollyanna view of the pandemic, but I think it's been an opportunity for people to better understand really how social media works. I think people did see the 2016 election, did see the 2020 election closer, did finally understand something about how their data is used. There's a great line that I got from one of the young kids I interviewed, and she says, I don't see the trouble with Facebook taking my data. Who would care about me and my little life? Who would care about me and my little life? People don't talk like that anymore. And so that's where I think the education, I'm old enough that the arguments about computer literacy when I started was, should it be Logo or BASIC or, C++, or or how much screen time. This is computer literacy now. It's educating people about privacy, intimacy, democracy. That is my deeply, deeply felt view.
Thank you, Sherry. And probably maybe just one last question is, as we sort of hopefully are coming out of pandemic in one form or the other, I don't know how much we have changed or transformed for better with this pandemic, yet to be seen. But as we come back together in organizations or institutions, such as MIT, for example, we have also seen the rise of things like, DEI movements and racial acceptance movements in the past 2 years, and all this in its many forms. What would you suggest that even an institution like MIT and others do to foster more genuine empathy as an organizational behavior trait what would some of those recommendations be?
I really believe in conversation. It's not because I'm retro. It's because conversation brings you to friction. It brings you to vulnerability. When I ask people who don't like to talk, who say I do everything on text, and I say why, they say, I'll tell you what's the wrong with conversation. It takes place in real time, and you can't tell what the other person's going to say. And that's what's right with conversation.
Right.
You have to do the work. You have to really, when I really look forward to talking with you, really, where you're not interviewing me, because I just think, my God, what a great conversation where I really get to ask you, and we really, because I bet you have some ideas about empathy that are different than mine. I really want to get into it. Conversation, it stretches the imagination. It opens you up. You develop the skills that you will need, ironically, for solitude. You learn in conversation the skills that you'll need to go away and sit by yourself. You develop yourself, and you learn about other people. But if you learn to look people in the eye, you learn to be vulnerable. It's behind our screens that we develop this, the illusion of friendship without the vulnerabilities of intimacy, and this idea that we can have the friendship without vulnerability. That's the magic trick that we've been selling ourselves on all these years.
Yep, sounds more like a snake oil sales pitch.
I think I've been trying to pitch this for a long time, but I think maybe my message maybe is still my message, but maybe more people have seen it now. So it's time to be vulnerable to each other, to say this pandemic has been hard. How has it been for you? How can we do better now? How can we teach now that we don't need to teach on screens? What should our classes look like? What should our classes really look like?
Great. Thank you so very much, Sherry. It's such a delight. It's such a joy.
Such a pleasure. Such a joy. Thank
you. And again, I recommend everyone to look for Empathy Diaries. And Sherry, I very much look forward to continuing our conversation online and offline.
Wait. And to all of you who've been listening.
Thank you so very much. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.